More terminology. Other people will say data analytics. As I said, lots of terminology flowing around. Well, I'm a statistician, and when I first heard all of this stuff, I thought, isn't it just statistics? Well, in fact, it is, but statisticians should be aware there's a bigger world out there. There's much more going on than just what statisticians do. In particular, there's lots of folks who want to play the data science big data game. There's computer scientists, applied mathematicians are getting engaged, particularly in terms of optimization. Bioinformatics is its own big subfield. And basically any science now, people are collecting data and they can do it really efficiently. So there's lots of data coming around here. And a very important thing for statisticians to think about is what do we have to offer to this effort? Well, I submit we have quite a bit. In particular, there's a vast collective knowledge. Many smart people have been working for a long time thinking about many different aspects of data analysis, and we need to keep reminding people of that. There's a lot of people that think, oh, we don't need that old statistic stuff. Let's do some better stuff. We can reinvent. Well, the problem with reinvention is you waste a lot of effort. Is it clear that funding agencies should be investing in reinvestment? This is something we should stress. Oops, oh my goodness, what did I do there? Okay. There's a number of pitfalls that are involved in data analysis. Statisticians understand very well, multiple comparisons and so on. Amateurs who try this sort of have to fall into those traps themselves to find out about those things. And the field is very diverse. Think of all the different ways people approach statistics, maybe Bayesian versus frequentist. You can think of so many things of that type. But statisticians have to keep reminding folks in this game. That's incumbent upon us. Okay, so how should statistics get engaged? Well, there's obvious tasks like parallelization. Modern computers have multiple cores that have to be carefully integrated. It takes a lot of work to do that. Also, I think it was time to rethink our models and our concepts. Let me just say a little bit more about the models concept stuff. When I was visiting Singapore, we discussed a lot this e-book by these guys, one of whom is a professor of law, the other of whom is a journalist. They wrote a book about big data, how wonderful big data is. And a major premise of this book is they sort of broke up data analytic methods in a couple of ways, one of which they called correlational, the other they call causal. What did they mean by that? Well, their causal data analysis is a data analysis where you try hard to understand underlying phenomena and what causes it, what the underlying drivers are. Of course, there's a well-known way of getting at this, what we call the scientific method. You want to know something, you first formulate a hypothesis, then you collect some data, then you do some data analysis, hypothesis tests or whatever. And this has some nice consequences. In particular, there's some very solid knowledge. What you find, you really know quite well. And furthermore, there's clear measures of how certain we are about what we know. The other type of data analysis goes in a really different direction. They say, well, it's really about finding correlations. The word mirror is kind of what I put in there as a statistician. But anyway, it's just about finding fairly superficial correlation. And there's strong motivations for this. It's been quite successful at a number of things. Think of voice recognition software. You make a telephone call to a corporation, you talk to a computer. That computer is recognizing your voice. That's voice recognition. That's one of the big successes of correlational data analysis. Now there's so many other types of recognition going on. We're hearing a lot about buying and selling of data these days. Data are valuable. Are they insightful? Well, there's a question mark. But the consequences are you get some automatic solutions to some very hard problems. A poster child these days is self-driving cars. All of that is done with correlational type of research. Okay, now, what about this discussion of correlation versus causation? How new is that? Well, if you read the book, they're saying, oh, this is exciting, it's great, there's so many cool things, there's great new ideas. And then they may say, oh, we got to change our statistics criteria. Well, if you talk to people, you'll find there's a set of people that not only want to change the curricula, they even want to throw it all away and start up data analytics. Okay, well, on the other hand, I've been around for a while, and as a statistician, I've looked kind of at the history of statistics, and so I'm now going to think about the big timeline of statistics. So those of you who know what I'm talking about realize this goes back way over 100 years. People have been thinking about all these methods. And one thing I've noticed is that while there is this sort of mainstream of statistics, there's also a set of people who've been doing data analysis outside of that context. Here I put some of these. I'm not going to go through these individually, but if you're my age, you'll recognize those things, and you realize they came along about every 10 years or so. Now, the big glory days of machine learning was the early 2000s, and so around about the mid-2000s, I was thinking, gee, isn't it time for a new one? I knew there was something coming. Now, if I was really smart, I could have predicted what it was, but I'm not that smart. In fact, of course, what it is big data science, sort of the next step in this progression. And now noticing that, I wonder what's going to happen in another 5 to 10 years. I predict there's going to be something. Can't tell you what it is, though. Okay, now let's think about those things. There are some differences between those. One difference is that some of them came along with really interesting new ideas. For example, neural networks is very cool. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. Neural networks is very cool because what they're doing is trying to reorganize algorithms so that they have a structure similar to what's going on in the human brain. Very clever idea. They scored some big successes. They way over-advertised. So then in the 2000s, it became a very negative thing, but now it's back under the guise of deep learning. But that one came along with a really different way of thinking. The same is true of machine learning. What was different about machine learning? The fundamental idea there was to use optimization methods to analyze data. Statisticians, of course, like probability methods. Machine learning people specialize in optimization. Once you take that new viewpoint, it opened up a whole wide range of interesting things to do. Now, what about some of those other ones? Well, the other ones were kind of less about new ideas, but more about this issue of causation versus correlation. Remember data mining? That sort of came and went a while. Now it's back, of course. Now, what's the big deal about data mining? Who's old enough to remember what was advertised as the great correlational discovery? Anybody? Too shy, okay. It was supermarket scanner data and the perhaps discovery that when people went in to buy, well, I don't know what you say in Spain. In America, we say diapers. In England, they say nappies. Anyway, it's things for babies. And maybe those of you with children have joined me in being sent out to buy some diapers and thinking, they sell beer here. Maybe I'll just have to buy some beer. And so that's sort of the poster child discovery for data mining. Okay, so some perspectives on that. Well, certainly that looks like a correlational discovery, right? You don't think a priori about it, but you can discover such things in the data. That's a correlational discovery. That's the power of correlational thinking. But why do we like it so much? Well, we like it so much because it makes causational sense. We can understand the drivers behind that in a very clear way. And so I argue it's a little early to drop causation ideas here, even if you want to think in a correlational type of way. Okay, now what about relative emphasis here of causation versus correlation? Well, classical statistics, admittedly, what we do is we really stress the causation part of that. Think of what we teach in the courses. There's so many things we want our students to know because there's so many different ways to go at this, and so we tend to emphasize the causation, and we only have so much time, and therefore we rather sacrifice the correlational parts of this. If you read the ebook, they go totally the other way. They say, oh, it's all about correlation, and they want to totally downweight the causation. Well, I think the truth is actually somewhere in between. Really, both of these are important players, and we should really be teaching both of those. Of course, we still have a limited time, so we're going to have to revise things. I think we really do need some changes in our curricula, how we teach these courses. Okay, let me throw out one more idea here, sort of at this level. Well-understood concept is that currently great science is being done by teams of people who bring different skill sets to the table. Even university administrators understand this. The age when great science was done by one person working alone in a lab is over with. Basically, what can be discovered in that mode is already pretty well known. And so you really need teams. Now, I do a lot of cancer research. In the cancer world, of course, biology is an important part of it, but the types of things that are done involve really rich chemistry, very complicated machinery put together by engineers. Oh yeah, we need a quantitative person. Well, here's a mistake that a lot of people, not just administrators, but scientists also make. A lot of people think it's enough to have one quantitative team member. Well, I think they could get away with that for a while, but looking at what's going on, I think the days of that are also ending. So I'm going to apply this same idea to quantitative work. I submit the great quantitative work in the future is going to need teams of people that bring different skill sets to the table. Now, of course, I'm a statistician, so I think a team should have a statistician to manage the uncertainty, but I'm going to show you later in the talk some deep image analysis driven by some of my collaborators. I don't do image analysis at the pixel level at all. I work with representations that people give me, and optimization is very important. I'm a big consumer of optimization. I come up with a new way of analyzing data. Typically, I need to solve some optimization problem that's frankly over my head. You need database, and we can go on depending on what you're tackling, but I think it's time to think of quantitative work being done in teams of people who bring different skill sets, and I think we should be training our students so that they can participate on such teams. Okay, so all of this, of course, feeds naturally into the big data science world. Okay, so let's see now. Big data science, I said this before, isn't it just statistics? Yes, but there's a bigger world. One more aspect of this I think people aren't paying enough attention to, and that is, well, big data science really does bring new challenges to us to work with. There's something people are not paying enough attention to, and that's the fact that an even bigger challenge is not big data, but complex data. Data which is very complicated. People are gathering more and more data. It's not just numbers. There's often a very rich structure to it, which should be taken into account during the data analysis. And this is where object-oriented data analysis comes up in an important way. So what's object-oriented data analysis? Well, my soundbite introduction is this. Think about the atom of a statistical analysis. I imagine many of you join me in teaching first courses in statistics. In a first course, the atoms, or experimental units, are numbers. More advanced statisticians will learn multivariate analysis, where the atoms are vectors. We try to think about variation in a population of vectors. Popular research areas, functional data analysis, where the atoms are curves. And object-oriented data analysis just goes into more general types of data objects. So let me give you some examples of some of mine. Well, curves are possibilities. So curves as data objects is just a special case of object-oriented data analysis. An interesting type of curves is spectra in the chemical sense. Wait, aren't those just curves? Well, yeah, they're curves, but they're non-negative, and the non-negativity is really important. So that actually introduces some important differences in the statistical analysis. I'm going to show you images and shapes here in a moment. I'm also interested in trees. I mean trees in the mathematical graph theory sense, sets of nodes and edges. Each data point is a tree. You've got a family of trees to think about. And there's others, for example, functional magnetic resonance imaging. Typical data object is a three-dimensional movie to look at, and you can go on and on. Okay, so curves as data. Here's a couple of my favorites. The one on the left is a genetic data set. For those of you who will be around at the workshop later, I'll say more about this data set in that workshop. Here's a set of data that I got from Andres Alonso at the University of Carlos III, one of my favorite data sets. I've also worked with images as data. Daniel and his student and I have had a lot of fun working with these with face images. There's a couple of other images. I'll say more about the one on the right in a moment. Here there's big challenges. There's high dimension, low sample size. Whatever you do with this image is going to have a lot of parameters, typically a lot more than the number of data points that you've got. That creates many interesting effects, some of which I'll discuss later in the week. Okay, what about shapes? Well, I'm going to talk about these things in a moment. Here's a tree. This is the tree of arteries in one person's brain. We have this great data set of 100 of them. When you have a set of trees as data objects, even issues like what's the average, how do you understand variation about the average, is quite a complicated issue. And I will say, Interestingly, I've tried a bunch of different approaches on the trees. In topological data analysis, persistent homology, that sometimes gets a bad name, but actually that worked the best of all the different methods that I've tried. Okay, now what about this object-oriented data analysis? I notice in the world of computer scientists, people love new names. They're happy to put names on everything and see what sticks, what gains traction, they'll say. In the statistics world, on the other hand, it's really hard to get people to go along with names. And I've noticed not many people have jumped into object-oriented data analysis. A few have. Well, what's it all about? I'm trained as a mathematician, and so originally I just wanted a mathematical framework that contained all these different things that I was doing, and so that was okay. But as I went on, I noticed there was actual real value to the terminology. In particular, it provides a focal point for complicated interdisciplinary analyses. So I do a lot of that. When somebody comes to me with a new challenge, it's not obvious even what should be the atoms of the analysis, so I found it very useful to say what should be the data objects. After people get that idea, then it really helps crystallize the conversation in a useful way, and we can get a handle on what's needed for the analysis. Okay, now let's get to a serious example. This is supposed to be something medical, so I better say something medical. I'm going to look at a set of data now of shapes. It's going to be organs in the male pelvis. In particular, the focus here is the prostate, and we're going to think about radiation treatment for prostate cancer. So cancer of the prostate is quite a deadly disease. A good treatment for it is radiation. They basically zap the prostate with radiation, but it's a very harsh treatment, so they don't do it once. They do it over the course of once a day, over the course of many days. And the game is to zap the prostate, but to miss everything else. Now, the prostate is attached to the bladder. It's in some sense the valve on the bladder, and it sits right on the rectum. So you have to be very careful not to zap those two, but to zap the prostate. Okay, so for the problem with this is these things live in the pelvis. They're kind of squishy things, and the bladder and the rectum have different behavior on the time scale of days, and so all these things move around, and so understanding that motion, the variation over time, is important. We're going to work here with a 3D CT, that's a 3D X-ray, and you're going to see that it's very challenging to find these things in there. That process is called segmentation, finding which set of voxels, three-dimensional pixels, represent the organ, or find the boundary of each object. Okay, so here I give you a picture that shows you the challenges here. This is a pretty good projector. These look pretty good. And so what are we seeing in there? Well, CT is three-dimensional. We're just looking at one slice. That slice is kind of going about like that. And you can see in there, CT is like X-ray, so bones show up as white. So you're seeing that tailbone there is white. There's another white there. That's a piece of hip bone going through this slice. Then you're seeing another tube that comes along right about here. Notice there's black spots. Those black spots are sparse areas. Those are gas bubbles, and that tells us that this tube going along here is the rectum. Now I'm going to tell you the bladder is about here, and the prostate is about there. So notice that's a very hard problem. If the prostate was white and everything else is black, it's really easy. But in fact, it's not. It's kind of a middle gray color. There's black and white outside of it, lots of noise. So there's big problems with contrast and noise here. Okay, so, well, if you know what you're doing, you can sort of do what I did there. Take that thing, draw a circle with a mouse. And so the old way to do this is called manual segmentation. A technician sits down, uses anatomical knowledge to draw those boundaries. Here's a result of a manual segmentation. The reason it's so jagged is this was done on a perpendicular set of slices. When you go through and take all those circles, put them back together, you get something that looks like that, or let me rotate it. Now you get an idea. I'm thinking about a three-dimensional object here. Okay, so that's a way to do that. That can take a good technician about 45 minutes. If you're doing a radiation treatment of 20 to 30 days, the cost is just prohibitive. You really can't do that. Okay, so I want to do something automatic. So for that, we're going to have to represent the shape somehow. I'm going to cut out the time. I could say more about this, but I'm just going to say we're going to use a skeletal representation. Think of it as a parametric model. Okay, so here's how the parametric model goes for a bladder, prostate, rectum. These are kind of, if you like, slabular objects. Think about the central sheet, the medial sheet. Discretize that into a set of yellow dots in a quad mesh. And then coming out from each, imagine these line segments coming out. These are called spokes. So spokes are going to come out. They're going to have the property that they're orthogonal to the boundary. And then these guys give us a parametric representation. We can move the dots around, move the spokes around. Until it fits the object. So when it fits, then the ends of the spokes determine a boundary. There's the boundary shown as a quad mesh. If you fill in the panels and use a light source plot, then you get a three-dimensional impression there. So think of this as a parametric model that we're fitting to one person. Okay, so now how do we fit that? Well, if you got the blue thing, the binary, then it's easy to do, but that's very expensive. So we really want something automatic, very challenging because of the poor contrast, noise, and so on. We really need to somehow borrow information. We're using anatomical knowledge. And so, well, for statisticians, a natural way to think about updating, borrowing information is to use a Bayes method. And that's exactly what we did here. So basically, we're going to take some of these binaries, maybe from somebody else or maybe from some preliminary analysis, use that to construct a prior distribution. Given a new image, we'll write down the likelihood, go through the Bayes calculation, come up with a posterior, which will maximize to give us an idea of where that thing is today. Okay, now as Bayesian methods go, this is embarrassingly simple because all we do is conjugate Gaussians. For the non-statisticians, what a conjugate Gaussian means is if both the prior and the likelihood are Gaussian, then the posterior is also Gaussian. So it's an easy calculation. One big problem is high dimension, low sample size. These are high parameters. If you can get 20 training cases, you're pretty lucky. Well, we'll tackle that by doing PCA-type calculations. But where it gets really interesting is the manifold aspect of the data. And this is where we've had a great deal of success by properly incorporating the mathematics. Okay, so what do you mean by manifold? Well, I'll say more about a manifold. Before I go there, I'd like to point out that manifold is used in statistics currently in two ways. One way is manifold data. Your data objects, the data points, lie on a curved surface. So that's manifold data. Oops. Wrong way. That's manifold data. The data lie on a known manifold. The other way that word appears in statistics right now is manifold learning. In manifold learning, you have some high-dimensional data set you believe follows some low-dimensional curved manifold, and the game is to find the manifold. So in manifold learning, you want to find it. In manifold data, you want to work with it. Okay, well, why a manifold? Well, let me go back to a really simple example now. The reason is because we've got data objects that are angles. Let me go back to the really simple context of directional data analysis. And so imagine I just have angles here. Maybe I got those 4 angles. And then we say, well, what's the average? So, of course, anybody could say, hey, they're numbers. Why don't I just add them up and divide by 4? Well, I'm seeing some skeptical looks here, of course. And the reason is you've been trained to think about angles as points on the unit circle. The unit circle is just a very simple, non-trivial manifold, and you can very clearly see that if you add them up and divide by 4, you're going to be over on the other side, which is somehow the worst notion of center that you can really come up with. And so what directional data is, of course, all about is using the unit circle structure in an intelligent way, and this is exactly an example of doing a proper analysis on a manifold. So I just wanted to get your attention that there's some real issues to pay attention to here. Okay, so natural data space is a smooth curved manifold. We got to start thinking about some differential geometry here. Okay, so what's a manifold? Well, the definition of a manifold is just a smooth curved surface where at every point there's an approximating tangent plane in the sense of shrinking neighborhoods around that point. That's about all you need to know for this talk. Okay, now imagine I got data distributed on the manifold. How can I do some analysis? Well, if the data aren't spread too far, you could think think about finding a center point of the data and putting that at the center point. I'm going to skip this stuff. Okay, so find a center point. Well, okay, what's a center point of data on the manifold? We can't quite average. You've got to rethink that a bit. There's a commonly used notion of center point called the geodesic mean. This is actually an idea that works in any metric space. So you got data in any metric space, say x1 up to xn, maybe imagine on the surface of the manifold. Metric space, you have a notion of distance. If you take a candidate point, look at the distance to all the data points, move that candidate or point around to minimize the sum of squared distances, and that minimizer may not be unique, maybe those minimizers are the geodesic means. Okay, so that works in any metric space. Now, why do we square? Well, the reason we square is because if you do this in the metric space of just Euclidean space and you use the classical L2 distance, this results in the sample mean. So that's why it's a generalization of the mean here, and this is one that generalizes that concept in a nice way. If you don't square, you get something more like the median. Okay, now if we do this in the context of geodesic distance, so now along the manifold, measure distance to be the shortest distance along the curved surface, then you get the geodesic mean, and that's the one I'm going to talk about here. I'm wondering how I'm doing for time. Anybody been watching the time? I've got to be a little careful here. Okay, good. Okay. Okay, so let's see now. We got, how do we do PCA on non-Euclidean spaces? Well, a nice PhD dissertation, and what I wish was mathematical statistics, was done by Tom Fletcher. He invented something called principal geodesic analysis. Tom is actually a computer scientist, not a statistician. But anyway, beautiful piece of work. His idea was this: well, what's principal components? You got a point cloud. You find the line which best represents the data in Euclidean space. That's the first principal component. Tom's idea was, well, what's a line on a manifold? Natural notion of a line is a geodesic curve, the curve that you follow when you walk straight, don't turn. So Tom's idea was find the geodesic that best fits the data. Very natural way to think about this. Now here's a result of the principal geodesic analysis on some bladder, prostate, rectum data. So think about these things lying along a surface. I found the geodesic that best fits. I'm going to start at the mean minus 2 standard deviations, go to the mean plus 2. I'm going to jump back and forth. As I do so, you get a real impression of the variation. Look at the first principal geodesic over here. Oops, did that go? Oh, it's a little slow. Okay, oh, there it goes, okay. Okay, so notice there's an interesting mode of variation. In particular, look at the rectum at the bottom. This is kind of about the rectum filling and emptying. Take a look at the second principal geodesic. Notice that is definitely a twisting mode. And the third one is about emptying and filling of the bladder. So notice it gives a really nice impression of variation in the data. Okay, so there's a picture of Tom. Now, there was, it turned out, a limitation to what Tom did. So that he could compute this using a tangent plane calculation, he insisted that his geodesics go through the geodesic mean. That makes it easy to work on the tangent plane. And you might say, well, what's the big deal? Of course, if I take Euclidean data and I do principal component analysis, I can find the line that goes through the data, and that contains the mean. Okay, why is that? Well, that's sort of a sum of squares type analysis. It's a Pythagorean theorem going on there. The Pythagorean theorem is a great property of Euclidean space, but once you go non-Euclidean, it doesn't work anymore. So in fact, it's no longer obvious that your first principal geodesic should go through the geodesic mean. And here's a counterexample. Imagine I have data on a sphere distributed along the equator. So here's a toy example. You can see that data sort of distributed there. Principal geodesic analysis. We're going to first find the geodesic mean. Where's that? Oops. Well, this is a case where the geodesic mean is not unique. It's both the North Pole and the South Pole. How can it be so far from the data? Well, keep in mind it feels biggest squared distance. Squared distance feels the biggest one very strongly. So if I go to the North Pole and the South Pole, I don't have anything that goes all the way around. And so that's why the North and the South Pole are the geodesic means. Now let's fit a tangent plane, and let's project the data up into the tangent plane. Notice something really bad has happened now, and that is, at the beginning, my data are somehow one-dimensional. There's really only one mode of variation there, yet to describe this with two components, I'm going to have to use two components. So that's a very inefficient fit there that's going to have serious ramifications. Okay, so this motivated these guys in Germany to come up with the idea they called geodesic PCA. And what they say is, well, Fletcher had a nice idea, but that constraint of going through the mean was too harsh. Let's relax that. We'll find any geodesic that fits. So for the data going around the equator, that's great, because then we get just one equator. Doesn't go through the geodesic mean, but it fits the data very well. Okay, so here's another example. What I'm showing you now is data that follow not a great circle like the equator, but a small circle like another line of latitude. Okay, so you could say, oh, come on, who cares about this? Well, where this came from was my bladder, prostate, rectum colleagues at one point put together a simulator model capturing what they think are interesting modes of variation, and I'm showing you the variation in one of the spokes in that simulator model. So the key idea is that for that type of SREP variation, this is a very important mode. Okay. So let's see, we got Fletcher's principal geodesic analysis, best fit of a geodesic to the data, constrained to go through the geodesic mean. The German guys, geodesic, take the best fit of any data. Because of the fact we saw that small circle mode of variation, we felt motivated to come up with a modification of that, where instead of fitting geodesics, we fit any circle to the set of data. So this is motivated by the complex analysis ideas and conformal maps. Okay, so you get an idea here. We just did a toy set of data just to show you what we're thinking about and how fitting small circles can give you a much better fit than you can get from the earlier methods. Okay, here's that same example with that spoke from the SREPs following the small circle. If we use a geodesic PCA, you can see that, well, it's not as bad as it looks. Notice this is 0.5 to 0.5, that's -2 to 0.2, but there really is a second mode of variation there. If we use a small circle analysis, then we can capture that very nicely. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to look at this data set. This is from the days of handwritten postcards or handwritten letters. For the younger people in the audience, we used to communicate by sending pieces of paper back and forth. You would write the address on there, and a lot of postal systems would use a code, a numerical code, and so they wanted to teach computers to do this. Nowadays, they do great work with deep learning. This is from the early days where they thought about modeling these things using landmarks. Okay, so here you see a landmark representation of these things. I got this from the nice Dryden and Mardia book on shape analysis. Okay, so what's shape analysis? Well, shape analysis is representing the shape. Now, you can use the coordinates of the landmarks there if you like, but the coordinates change if you move the thing or if you rotate it and or resize it. And so shape is about modding those things out. And essentially what you end up with when you do a landmark-based shape analysis is data objects that lie in a high-dimensional sphere. So those things I was talking about, analysis on the sphere, is an important thing to do in shape analysis. And so this motivated thinking about trying to do PCA, fitting the circles, only trying to fit them on higher dimensional spheres. So on higher dimensional spheres, you can do all the same stuff. You can do PCA on projections. You can do geodesics through the mean. You can do geodesics where you fit any geodesics. All these issues come up again. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about a new approach that came from Ian Dryden, the shape expert, and my former student Song-Kyu Jun, that we call principal nested spheres analysis. Okay, so here's the idea. Think about data which follow not a small circle, but a slightly lower dimensional sphere. And so we're going to generalize this from the two-dimensional sphere to the k-dimensional sphere. So here's Song-Kyu and Ian. Okay, so here's how that go. Imagine data just distributed somehow on the sphere. And what I'm going to do is fit the sphere of one lower dimension. So I'm going to look at projections onto that. So there's an example of a sphere of one lower dimension. Now you're thinking about a k-dimensional sphere. I'm going to fit a sphere of dimension k minus 1. Okay, now let's see. There's a candidate for it. I'm going to think about, first off, the sphere. How do I determine that? Well, it's pretty easy to work with because a sphere is just an intersection of the big sphere with a hyperplane. So I just have to take a hyperplane parameterized by its normal vector and its distance to the origin. So mathematically, it's not hard to work with. We'll slice that, and then I'm going to look at projections that go along the surface. So these are the same geodesic projections. You can see those guys going around there. Okay, now what about that sphere? Does that fit well? Well, no, you can clearly see it doesn't. Some of these projections or residuals are small, some are pretty big. So what I'm going to do now is think about getting the best fit that I can in the sense of sum of squares. And so we'll wiggle that plane around until we minimize the sum of squared residuals. Okay, so that's a straightforward operation. Now, what am I going to do for the PCA? Well, I need my PCA scores. So what I'm going to do is save those residuals as PCA scores at the highest level. Okay, so I end up with scores, and then I've got the green dots, which are the projections. Those are the lower dimensional representation. Those now live in a sphere of one lower dimension. So I'm going to reduce the dimension now, and on that lower dimensional sphere, I'm going to do the same thing, come down in dimension successively. At every point, at every stage, I get the residuals of one lower dimension, which become the scores. Okay, so I repeat that, and that gives something called a principal nested sphere analysis. Okay, so let's take a look at the results of that on the digit 3 data. Okay, let's see what I can do. Okay, so you saw several analyses there. So the one on the upper left is the first principal geodesic analysis. So I'm not going to incorporate the curvature of the space. I'm just going to fit the geodesic, and it looks like that. Okay, so notice that mode of variation. First off, did you notice that every point kind of moves in a linear way? Second off, notice it pretty much left the space of threes. In one direction, it goes to a C, and in the other direction, it even crosses in the middle there. So it's following a line that kind of leaves a space of threes. Now let's look at the second geodesic. Notice that takes a really different shape. That makes sense because they're perpendicular in some sense. But notice all the points there moved in a linear way. Now I'm going to look at the principal nested spheres. Okay, now notice those points. I guess if I go back, what happens? Oh, I can do that. Oh, awesome. Okay, good. Okay, so notice, first off, that goes much further through the space of threes. Notice the points don't move in a linear way. So in this big three space, I'm capturing much more of the variation with that first principal geodesic. Now take a first principal nested spheres. Now notice this one. Gee, there's a lot less variation. That's actually good, and the reason is because the first one captures so much of the variation. With principal components, you want a signal compression. You want to put as much as you can into as few components as you can. Okay, so now let's go to the SREP space. Now the challenge in SREP space is they live in quite a complicated manifold. Every one of those yellow dots is summarized by a point in R3. There's the length of the spoke, that's an R+, and then there's the two sets of directions there. Question? Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, great. Okay, so how do we tackle that? Well, we now know how to do statistics on spheres. So a method we call composite principal nested spheres is we do principal nested spheres on each one. That gives us a Euclidean representation. Take all of those points, put them into a vector, and then we can do Euclidean PCA on that. So that's something we call principal nested spheres. Okay, so I have to say my image colleagues are very happy with principal nested spheres. And recall back at the Bayes segmentation that we do. We need to fit a Bayes representation. We need to reduce the dimension with some PCA. And in the days of principal geodesics, a good segmentation problem would typically take about 20 components. Okay, so do 20-dimensional PCA. When we do the composite principal nested spheres, we could get away with only 13. 13. So you notice it's a big reduction. Working in 13-dimensional space is much easier than working in 20-dimensional space, and of course it resulted in visually much better fits to the data. Why was that? Well, I think the reason is those modes of variation tended to follow the small circles, which is what we naturally capture with the principal nested spheres. Okay, now I will say work is going onwards. Now there's been some meeting of various colleagues here, and they've come up with something called polysphere PCA. I'm not going to put in much effort, but the main idea is to take these complicated spaces, find an approximating high-dimensional sphere, and then do principal nested spheres on that. So work on that is currently underway. Okay, now there's a mathematical reason why principal nested spheres was also very important, and that is that it motivated the idea that we call backwards PCA. So what's backwards PCA? Well, the idea is just replace the forwards view with the backwards view. Now what's all that forward-backward stuff? Well, it comes from multiple linear regression. Nowadays everybody does sparsity, but in the pre-sparsity days, people thought about a forwards model where they'd iteratively add variables, or they might take a backwards where they iteratively reduce. That's the backwards and forwards I'm thinking about. Okay, so I'm just going to skip through this kind of stuff. Okay. I'm going to skip some of this. Time is getting short here. Okay, so why does backwards PCA work better? Well, I've done this in a bunch of different settings, and I've wondered why. My colleague Jim Damon from the UNC Math Department gave me a really good idea, which is that when you work in a backwards way, as you come down in dimension, every time you come down in dimension, you add a linear constraint. And Jim's idea is that you can add a constraint one at a time. If you're going to go forwards, you essentially have to know all the constraints in advance and then work them out, much harder to work with. Okay. All right, so let me wind up here. Thinking big picture again, what do you think are the boundaries of statistics? What's publishable in a paper? I'm talking about a lot of geometry and stuff like that. Should that be in the statistics world? What about fundable research? Should we be funding research in such an area? In general, what about new ideas and new ways of thinking? Are these allowed in statistics, or should we call them in the big data science? Notice that's a set subtraction. Should it be big data science set subtract statistics? Sometimes I really wonder about these issues. All right, so carry away concept. Well, I love my object-oriented data analysis. Notice it's more than a framework. It's a focal point, and I think it highlights pivotal choices here when you're doing complicated data analyses. What should be the data objects? How should they be represented? Okay, I'm going to quit here. Thank you very much.